It was supposed to be a simple task, a quick moment to help Caleb, my stepson, find a missing tie he swore was somewhere in my closet. The storm outside had just started to pick up, the wind howling against the old wooden windows of our Savannah home. I wasn't wearing much. I had spent the day cleaning and hadn't bothered to dress fully, slipping on a loose summer dress to combat the stifling heat beneath it. Nothing but my bare skin. It wasn't laziness, it was comfort, something I hadn't afforded myself in years. The weight of life, marriage, and responsibilities had dulled my own sense of self, but today, alone and unbothered, I allowed myself this tiny indulgence. Caleb's voice carried from the hallway, muffled but growing louder as he approached. "I swear it's there somewhere, Alexis," he said, his tone half annoyed, half apologetic. He had always been respectful, formal even, calling me by my first name as though the word stepmom was too much for him to bear. All right, I replied, waving him in with a casual gesture as he stepped into the walk-in closet. He filled the space almost instantly, tall, broad-shouldered, with an energy that was equal parts restless and magnetic. At 18, he carried himself with an ease I envied. I could see hints of his father in him, but Caleb had a youthfulness that made David seem even more distant, more absent than he already was. The storm outside escalated suddenly and without warning. The closet door slammed shut behind us. The sound was jarring, sharp, and final. We both turned toward the door, startled. "Caleb?" I muttered, stepping forward to jiggle the handle. It wouldn't budge. "It's locked," Caleb muttered, his fingers still trying unsuccessfully to open it. I moved beside him, my heart beating a little faster. "Is it locked?" I asked, my voice carrying more disbelief than concern. "Seems like it," he said. The reality of the situation began to settle. The closet, while spacious, suddenly felt smaller. The air, already thick from the humid Georgia summer, became oppressive. "Let me try calling your dad," I said, reaching for my phone. The screen lit up, but there was no signal. Caleb did the same, holding his phone high, but it was just as useless. "It's this damn storm," he said, his frustration barely veiled. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The air grew heavier, and I could feel beads of sweat forming at the nape of my neck, trickling down my spine. The lack of ventilation was suffocating. "Is it just me, or is it getting ridiculously hot in here?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. "It's not just you," I admitted, tugging at the neckline of my dress, fanning myself with one hand. The fabric clung to me, damp with perspiration, and the heat seemed to amplify every sensation. Caleb pulled off his t-shirt, tossing it onto a nearby shelf. His skin glistened, the lines of his muscles more pronounced under the dim light of the closet. It was such a simple act, yet the intimacy of the confined space made it feel different. "You should do the same," he said, gesturing to my dress. "Not to be weird, but you look like you're about to overheat." I hesitated, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite name. He was right, the heat was unbearable, but I was acutely aware of my lack of undergarments. The thought of standing there exposed sent a flush through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I'll manage," I said, forcing a smile. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he sat on the floor, leaning back against the wall. His gaze lingered on me, and I couldn't tell if it was concern or something else entirely. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone light, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with my phone, but the screen was blank, no notifications, no distractions. The only thing I could focus on was the oppressive heat and the awareness of Caleb's presence. The minutes dragged, and eventually I gave in. "All right, fine," I said, my voice carrying a hint of resignation. I turned my back to him, slipping the straps of my dress down my shoulders and letting the fabric pull around my waist. I kept my arms crossed over my chest, facing the wall as I felt the cooler air touch my bare skin. I could feel his eyes on me, and the silence between us was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of unspoken thoughts, of things neither of us dared to address. "You don't have to be so modest," he said after a beat, his voice low, almost teasing. I turned to face him, keeping my arms folded tightly. "I think I have every reason to be," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. He chuckled softly, leaning his head back against the wall. "Fair enough," he said, but his gaze didn't waver. It was steady, searching, and I could feel the heat of it as though it were a physical touch. I looked away, but the damage was done. Something had shifted between us. Something had shifted between us as the hours stretched on. The heat seemed to blur the lines of propriety. Every movement, every glance, carried an undercurrent of something neither of us could name, but both of us felt. And just as I began to wonder how much longer we could endure this stifling space, a distant noise interrupted my thoughts. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to jolt me back to reality. "What was that?" Caleb asked, his voice breaking the fragile tension. I held my breath, listening intently. It could have been nothing, or it could have been the sound of rescue. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. This moment, this tension, wasn't something that could be undone. It had already imprinted itself in ways I couldn't yet understand. The air was growing heavier by the second, thick and oppressive, like a smothering blanket. Each breath felt laborious, pulling the stagnant heat into my lungs and leaving behind an uncomfortable, clinging sensation on my skin. The closet had become a suffocating prison, and every passing moment seemed to amplify the tension, not just from the air, but from the unspoken presence of. Caleb, sitting a mere few feet away from me, had stripped his shirt off earlier, the sweat glistening on his skin, catching the dim light as it filtered through the cracks in the door. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on my phone's useless screen, pretending to search for a signal that I knew wouldn't come. But the truth was, I could feel his presence like an electric charge in the room, humming and alive. "It's unbearable in here," he muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was deeper than usual, rough from the heat and frustration. He shifted against the wall, leaning his head back and closing his eyes. "I don't know how much longer we can sit like this," I nodded absently, tugging at the hem of my dress. The fabric was clinging to me, damp with sweat, and every movement made it stick uncomfortably to my skin. I could feel beads of moisture trailing down my back, pulling at the small of my spine, and for the first time, I was grateful Caleb wasn't looking at me. "You should probably take that off," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He opened his eyes and looked at me, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Your dress. You're sweating buckets, and it's not like anyone's going to see. It's just us. Just us." The words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning I couldn't quite place, or maybe didn't want to. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, too quickly, and his lips curved into a faint smile as though he'd caught me in a lie. "You don't look fine," he said, leaning forward slightly. The movement was subtle, but in the confined space, it felt magnified. He was close enough now that I could see the faint sheen of sweat along his jawline, the way it traced the curve of his neck and disappeared beneath the waistband of his jeans. I swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of everything: the heat, the sound of my own breathing, the way my dress clung to my thighs. It was as though the walls of the closet were closing in, forcing me to confront something I wasn't ready to face. "I'll manage," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back again, his expression unreadable. "Suit yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel his eyes on me, though he wasn't looking directly at me anymore. It was the kind of awareness that burrowed under your skin, making you hyper-conscious of every movement, every breath. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The heat was unbearable, and the damp fabric of my dress was sticking to me like a second skin. With a sigh, I reached for the hem and pulled it over my head in one swift motion, turning my back to Caleb as I did so. The air felt cooler against my skin, though it did little to alleviate the flush creeping up my neck. I folded the dress neatly and placed it on the shelf, keeping my arms crossed over my chest as I turned back around. Caleb's eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. His gaze flicked downward briefly, so brief that I might have imagined it, but the heat in his expression was unmistakable. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. I couldn't stand it anymore, I replied, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He nodded, his eyes lingering on me for just a moment too long before he looked away. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy, unspoken thing that neither of us dared to address. Do you think anyone will find us soon? He asked, his voice breaking the silence. I don't know, I admitted, sitting down on the floor across from him. The cool wood against my skin was a welcome relief, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. We sat like that for a while, the silence stretching between us, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the house or the distant rumble of thunder. I tried to focus on anything but him, the pattern of the wood grain, the faint smell of cedar lingering in the air, but it was no use. I could feel his presence like a physical thing, the heat of his body radiating across the small space that separated us. And though I knew it was wrong, though I told myself I was imagining it, there was a part of me that couldn't deny the charge in the air, the way his gaze seemed to linger just a little too long. You're different than I thought you'd be, he said suddenly, his voice soft, almost contemplative. What do you mean? I asked, my brow furrowing. I don't know, he said with a shrug. You're just not what I expected. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. Instead, I leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes and trying to ignore the way his words made my stomach twist in a way that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last, the heat, the silence, the proximity. It was all too much, and though I told myself it was just the circumstances, just the heat and the tension of being trapped, there was a part of me that knew better. As the storm outside raged on, the storm inside the closet was only just beginning. And as Caleb shifted slightly, his knee brushing against mine, I realized that no amount of distance, or lack thereof, could change what was already happening between us. Staying too far could be massively unsettling. If only I'd known then how much that moment would change everything. But some things, it seems, are meant to unfold in ways we can never predict. The air between us felt different now, not the heavy, stifling heat that had cloaked us for hours in the confined space of the closet, but something more intangible, electric, alive, and undeniable. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn and crossed without either of us acknowledging it. I could feel it in the way Caleb's eyes lingered just a fraction too long, in the weight of his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking. And maybe I wasn't blameless. Maybe I felt it too, the pull, the unspoken tension that seemed to coil tighter with every moment we spent in this suffocatingly close proximity. But what could I do? I told myself it was the heat, the isolation, the absurdity of the situation. Surely, once we were freed, this would all dissipate like a mirage in the desert. Do you think they'll start looking for us soon? Caleb asked, his voice low and edged with frustration. I glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but his face gave nothing away. I'm sure they will, I replied, though. I wasn't entirely sure who they were. My husband, David, the housekeeper, who was likely on her day off. The truth was, I had no idea how long we'd be stuck here, and the thought made my chest tighten. Caleb sighed, leaning back against the wall. His bare chest gleamed faintly in the dim light, a sheen of sweat accentuating the defined planes of muscle. I tried not to notice, but the way the shadows danced across his skin made it impossible not to. You know, he said after a moment, his tone more casual, I don't think we've ever really talked. I mean, really talked. His words caught me off guard, and I looked at him, startled. What do you mean? I asked. He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. I don't know. You're my dad's wife, and I'm his son. It's like we're supposed to coexist, but I've always felt like we're just strangers living in the same house. The honesty in his voice made my stomach twist. He wasn't wrong. Our interactions had always been polite, cordial even, but they lacked warmth or familiarity. Caleb had come into my life when he was already a teenager, and I'd assumed he preferred it that way. I guess I just didn't want to overstep, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked at me then, his dark eyes searching mine. You couldn't overstep if you tried. Something about the way he said it made my pulse quicken. There was a softness in his tone, a sincerity that caught me off guard. I felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through me, equal parts comfort and discomfort, as though I was standing too close to a fire, but couldn't bring myself to move away. "Well," I said, trying to lighten the mood, "there's no time like the present, I suppose." He smiled, a slow, easy grin that made something flutter low in my stomach. "Guess not." The conversation that followed felt strange, almost surreal. We talked about everything and nothing, filling the oppressive silence with stories and laughter. He told me about his friends, his plans for college, his frustrations with his dad's constant absence. I found myself opening up too, sharing bits of my life I hadn't even realized I'd been holding back. "I used to be a dancer," I said at one point, surprising even myself. "Seriously?" His eyes widened, genuine interest lighting up his face. I nodded, feeling a faint blush creep up my neck. "Ballet. It feels like a lifetime ago now." "I can't believe you never mentioned that," he said, shaking his head. "That's, I don't know, kind of amazing." I laughed softly, though the sound felt foreign in my throat. Amazing? Hardly. It was just something I loved, but life has a way of pulling you in different directions, doesn't it? He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I guess. But it's still part of who you are, right?" The sincerity in his words caught me off guard, and I looked away, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. It had been so long since anyone had seen me, really seen me, not as David's wife or someone's stepmother, but as my own person. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like an extension of the conversation, as though words weren't necessary to convey what was being said. And then, without warning, he shifted closer. It was subtle at first, a movement that could have been incidental, but the space between us seemed to shrink until I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "I'm glad we're talking," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," I replied, though my voice caught slightly on the words. He reached out then, a small, hesitant gesture, and brushed a strand of hair from my face. The touch was so light, so fleeting, that it could have been accidental, but the look in his eyes told me otherwise. My breath hitched, and I froze, unsure of what to do or say. The air between us felt charged, crackling with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. The word caught in my throat, and I looked away, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady, grounding. I didn't know what he meant, but in that moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that everything could be okay, that this strange, unexpected connection we'd found wasn't as dangerous as it felt. Up until he met me. But deep down, I knew better. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. And as his hand lingered near mine, the barest hint of contact sending a shiver down my spine, I realized we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us fully understood. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling against the walls of the house. Inside, another kind of storm was brewing, quieter, but no less destructive. And as the minutes stretched into hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards something inevitable, something that would change everything. I just didn't know how or when. The air inside the closet felt